and welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Today we're going to continue our examination of famous philosophers by looking at Immanuel Kant. Kant was a man who thought about and contributed to many subfields of both philosophy and science. He was the first person to teach geography as its own subject, identifying how winds stem from the Coriolis effect. He also postulated that the solar system was born from a nebula, that the Milky Way was a disk of stars, and that the moon's gravity would slow the Earth's rotation, resulting in tidal locking. Believe it or not, these aren't even the things that he's known for. So Kant's an interesting guy.
Oh, yeah.
And we did a show on Hegel, and it was the same thing. And really, a lot of these philosophers are. Like, nothing will make you feel more humble than looking up the lives of some of these famous philosophers, because what you see again and again is what flies in the face of stereotypes, rather than these guys who are just sitting in dusty libraries with overstuffed armchairs.
And you've got the painting of them old and sitting there staring out at you, and
just thinking and not really doing anything. All of a sudden you find out, this guy was the wrestling champ of the world, or this guy invented geography, all this different kind of stuff. Yeah. They're always much more interesting characters, and in a lot of cases, you can see that they're going out and they're applying a lot of the knowledge that they're thinking about to real world activities.
And you hit it. They're human. They're people. And I've been in situations with students and with acquaintances who, as soon as they find out something wrong or limiting about the philosopher, they say, "See, he didn't know anything because he was." I'm thinking, think about your own life. Have you ever not done something that's antithetical to what you think you believe? And here's a man who I've appreciated Kant for a long time, but I've particularly find affinity with him on some things. Would we have ever been friends? I probably wouldn't have been able to stand in the same circle with him, but we could have been. He taught. He had a full-time teaching position at age 46 or 47, something like that. But interestingly, he had sort of the life of a community college teacher, in the sense that he wasn't hired to teach philosophy exclusively, or sometimes even primarily. I should say he's teaching geology. He was teaching mineralogy. He was teaching. So he's handed this whole array, and he had 20 hours of student contact a week, and then all of the other work that goes along with it. And he'd essentially been an adjunct before that. They didn't call it that back then. He had a person, Lampe, who was his servant. That's not the right word. He lived with him. He was butler doesn't work. It was but he was very rigid in some of the things about his life. You wake up at 5, you go to bed at 10. And if he was out with a friend and that violated that, and he'd get home like 10 after 10, then he'd just be apoplectic, because all of the pattern had been shifted. And yet he loved to play pool. He loved to drink with his friends. He had one meal a day, a huge, huge luncheon they would invite friends to, that they would have after the morning classes. Then do it, the teaching work in the afternoon, some writing. At night, he would go out or go for a walk or whatever. And then 10 o'clock, he wrote a little pamphlet on about physical health. But it's what we call a polymath, somebody who knows a little about a lot and quite a lot about a lot. And that makes him so human. You look at him, and he could have been. He would look fragile, small, slender man, intense blue eyes apparently, but a great sense of humor. And so as soon as you saw the eyes and he started playing pool and you found out he's really good, then all of those human elements, you take it back to what he wrote, and you say, this was a really realized person.
Yeah, he really is a fascinating guy, and he is a good example of that complexity. Where we so often just try to portray people as being two-dimensional. Mm-hmm. And so it's easy to say, oh, well, yeah, the neighbors said that they could set their their watches by his schedule, and he never married. So, he was probably just a sourpuss or whatever. No, he's a super social guy, and everybody liked him. And, but yeah, just different, you can't predict what somebody's whole life is by looking at one aspect. So all the different aspects are going to be, different. So do you want to cover any more biographical information about him before we dive in? Or
only we should situate him in the historical context. He's born in 1724 and he died in 1804. So when the American Revolution happened, he was middle-aged. Well, we would call middle-aged. He only got 7 hours of sleep a night, but he lived until he lived a long time. And so the great foment of the Enlightenment age, with all of the collisions of ideas, and the idea of rationality being so very important, that's really where he was living.
Yeah, and we'll see as we start talking that's important. There was a lot of thinkers that came before him, and the philosophical thought of the time was kind of heading in one direction, and in his view, starting to stagnate.
Yeah.
And what he came in and did to the field kind of really sent it off in several directions, some of them that he didn't even agree with. But it really was kind of a turning point in philosophical thought.
Yeah, he was a number of people remark about this. I remember my philosophy teachers said something about this too, that he was sort of the focal point, the lens. Well, you and I before the show were just experiencing VR and the black hole. Well, he's all the philosophical thought before him sort of filtered into him. He shook it up, and then he essentially had an effect, as you say, in many fields, that was refiltered through him. So it's kind of a glass, the light's going through, and he's resetting what philosophy is about.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about light is anytime you put it through a lens, it bends. There's no linear exit there. So, he really changed, a lot of things about philosophical thought.
Yeah.
So what are some of those things? What is he known for?
The categorical imperative, the idea that if you're going to have, I'll back up. He was primarily known for thinking really hard about epistemology, which we've talked about, which is how you know things, ethics, what might I, ought I, or should I think about doing, and metaphysics, which is what's out there and what's my role in all of this. But the categorical imperative in the ethics part is often what's referred to with him, which is as much as to say, essentially, if you're going to establish or discover a moral law, that it needs to reach the level of being able, you ought to consider it as something that should apply to everyone, regardless of class, status. He was early in his life what we would call he was a racist in many ways by our terms. By the end of his work, he was arguing that slavery was abhorrent, that people needed to be treated equally, and so on. So he made a shift in his life, which is a positive thing. But in any case, the idea of the categorical imperative, whether he lived it doesn't matter whether a philosopher lived it absolutely well, because nobody's perfect and a human. But the idea that you want to try to establish rules for somebody else, it must not limit somebody else's freedom as long as it doesn't hurt you.
Yeah, and his entire experience with race is again, it's an example of the complexity of human beings, right? Because, like you said, early on in his life, he was a racist, and by the end, he had changed. I'm really glad that he didn't get canceled early on, right?
Yeah,
because he didn't participate in some of his greater work until late middle age.
Right, he was trying to essentially, in some way, we trying to find what his place was, what his work was. The other thing he's known very well for is it's called transcendental idealism. And boiled down, what that means is the recognition his view is that because we are human and we have human perception, and we've talked about perception and so on before, that it is impossible to see what's really there because of the limits of our senses and our preconceived ideas, which we can break out of some of the preconceived ideas if we work hard at it. But nonetheless, we can only know the phenomena that we encounter.
Yeah, and that's some of the really cool stuff that's sort of mind-bending that we'll get into.
Yeah.
I like what you said earlier, talking about, what he was interested in. I got the quote from him, which he says, thus the entire armament of reason is in the undertaking that one can call pure philosophy is in fact directed only at the three problems that have been mentioned: God, the soul, and freedom. Right.
Yeah.
And so, he, those, like you were talking about, those things that he's known for, that really was his focus.
What can I know? What should I do? And how and for what may I hope?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just,
it
seems simple, but it's not.
Right. And these are all concepts that we've talked about in the past. So in a way, a lot of our philosophy podcast is based off of work that Kant did. We've talked about a priori and a posteriori, and we haven't talked about analytic versus synthetic now so much, but not in those terms, but in the concepts and things. So can you explain what Kant's views on the nature of reality were? What were his thoughts considering these big questions?
That we can, to start it, the only things that we can know are the things that we determine based on our perceptions. And we know that people have different perceptions. We know so much more now about perception than we did. We still don't know that much, but we know. So I don't know what Kant would have said about, for instance, to say on that topic, hearing color, synesthesia, tasting color, something, or sound. I think that he would have said, you see, there's how things are. He wouldn't have been the mechanistic, neurocognitive kind of philosopher that we have now. I think it would have been anathema to him to say, oh, it's all just because of the electrical sparks in our brain.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That there is, for him, there was a noumenal world or a noumenal world, which is the entirety of reality outside of us. And then the limitations of what we can know inside, which means we can come to know some things perhaps, but we're never going to be able to answer lots of the questions that we ask. But the human condition for him was, you can't escape that. If you're fully functioning and fully alive, you are driven to ask the questions, and you're not going to be able to get the answers, but you're going to keep seeking.
Yeah, which, I mean, everything that you just said, it was kind of controversial at the time because, like we had talked about early on, philosophical thought was kind of heading in one direction, empiricists and things, and David Hume was kind of the culmination of that, where it was saying, listen, we can't know anything. Like maybe there isn't really, I don't know, maybe and basically Kant was like, I don't believe that, right? There has to be something. We have to be able to know something.
Right.
So how do you say you can be able to know something and then prove it? And we've run into this problem on the show, right? Thinking about, knowledge, like, man, wow, can you really know anything? I don't know.
Can you prove it?
And, all the difficulties that go along with that.
Causality.
Yeah.
You talked about David Hume. David Hume blew Kant's mind. Hume was 20 years older than Kant. But Hume essentially, among all the things that he said causality really doesn't work. Just because something happens doesn't mean that that's why it happened, so to speak. And it blew Kant's mind, and he was grateful to Hume because it made him, shook him up and think about it all again. So here's an example. I was thinking about it when I was coming over here today. This is a marvelous, great blue heron that was flying off of Silver Lake. It was over a farmer's field. It was heading toward two trees. I lost sight of it. And I pulled off the side of the road. I watched this, and it's grand. You're supposed to make a wish on it. If you make a wish on a flying blue heron, it's supposed to come true. But Kant would say, hey, prove that. Right? But anyway, and so my first thought was, well, it just flew off the lake and it went and landed in a tree. Do I know that? Of course I don't know that. It may have flown off some farmer's pond, not Silver Lake. I didn't see it lift off the water. I didn't see it land in the tree. I saw it disappear between two trees and might have continued flying. So it's probable that the heron came off the lake because there's a heron rookery on the lake at one end of it. I've seen them. I've been among them in the past kayaking. So I know that I have seen that. And from that, I could then say, well, it's a puddle of a lake. It's beautiful, but it's not that big. So if some heron's flying around, it's probably coming from there. I really don't know where it went. My mind was seeking closure. It started here, it ends there. Well, no. So anyway, Kant would have us think about that and say, well, okay, so probably it came from here. Yes, you don't know where it went, but you know something. Maybe.
Right. Yeah, and that's where he was a little bit different. Was we're getting into the a priori and the a posteriori knowledge, which is that a posteriori requires an experience in order to have knowledge about something, right? So, I have these. So you experienced seeing the herring,
yes.
Right? Once the herring's out of sight, anything that the herring does out of sight is no longer an a posteriori experience.
Right.
And then we've talked about this in the past. If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? It's a ridiculous question, right? Well, not really, because if you're not there to hear it, you can't say that it makes a sound. Now, of course, we have a scientific instrument that could pick it up. But at that point, is that a posteriori or is that a priori?
At that point, you're having
an experience of hearing the tree, but it's through a technological media that you weren't there, you weren't directly there. So,
and suppose the speaker broke, or somehow the computer's on mute, and you don't hear oh my gosh, the tree didn't fall, or didn't make a noise when it fell. Well, yeah, unmute.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a demonstration of the fragility there. And for something to be a posteriori knowledge, it really has to follow a pretty strict criteria. And so kind of the philosophers of the time, a priori knowledge wasn't really in vogue when Kant said, no, you know what? You can know some things without having a direct experience of them.
You may not be absolute.
Right.
But you can know them.
Which is when Kant started blowing other philosophers' minds.
And he also asserted the necessity of time and space. Some philosophers were questioning that. And of course, now in metaphysical terms, quantum physicists and so on, we have a lot of questions about time and space. But that was part of what Kant thought you need. Just, again, picturing what we're doing. I'm here in this studio. I see the microphone in front of me. I see you. I notice that you have a different haircut. I see all kinds of items around. I hear things in the background that aren't necessarily to do anything with the podcast. And we get all these sensations. And Kant essentially said we would be paralyzed with the constant bombardment of senses unless we had some kind of organizing principle. And the organizing principle is the assertion of that I-ness, capital I, that in time and space decides how to put all those pieces together and prioritize them.
Yeah, and so it's wild because like we just talked about, Kant was sort of the lens, that took the philosophy that was happening and bent it and then reflected, in a different way, refracted it in a different way. And I feel like where we're at currently in time is the point where that light is going to get put through another lens, because a lot of the things that he sort of postulated about, if, a quarter of a century ago, we'd still be looking at them and thinking, wow, that's an amazing insight for that time. And I'm not saying that it's not anymore, but what I'm saying is that what's happened in the past quarter of a century or so has started to erode some of those things that were the great insights of that time. And that idea, space and time, right? He says space and time are necessities, right? They're not a posteriori knowledge. They're what is required to even have experiences.
The structure.
That's a incredible insight for that time. And I mean, you think about space and time, he's talking about them in the same breath, which is something that, Einstein would look at 150 years later. And so his ability to rationalize things, the Milky Way is a disk of stars. He had no way of knowing that. Hey, the nebula that we see through the telescope, those might also be clumps of stars. The solar system formed out of a clump of gas. All of these things, the moon's going to tidally lock the Earth, all this stuff, right? I mean, the guy was a shining example of the a priori knowledge he was trying to espouse. He did an excellent job of rationalizing these things.
Not for nothing was he called the Sage of Königsberg.
Yeah. So he was amazing, and I don't mean to downplay that at all.
But he would also embrace exactly what you're saying. He wouldn't have, I don't know him except through. Do I know Kant? No. I know of him. I can experience his writing through translation.
So this is a thought exercise right here, right? We have no a posteriori knowledge of him because we never met the man himself. And our a priori knowledge is limited because we can read his works, but we cannot know the thing in itself that was Kant. So we can look at his words, but we don't know the meaning behind them because we weren't Kant. And there's a lot of arguments about what he did mean when he was talking
back and forth, things. Defensive arguments, supportive arguments. Yes. And that's why I say Kant, I think, doesn't matter what I think, but I think that Kant would have said, yeah, good, move forward. You got all this knowledge we didn't have, or seeming knowledge that we didn't have. Good. What are you going to do with it? Because he had said, this is that other thing that was he's known for. I'll destroy the Latin, but it's sapere aude, a term which means you must exercise your reason. He was saying that's really the first principle. Far too many people let other people tell them what they're supposed to think. Church, books, other people who seem to have more force in their lives than themselves. And you cannot know without putting firsthand your reason into active mode and thinking it through. I think it's more important for today than ever.
Yeah, and really where he he put that into practice, or where it was most relevant, was in his discussions of morality, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to talk about before we got there was just, he was an amazing guy. He did all this stuff. He had a lot of insight. But it almost seems to me like he is the philosophical equivalent of Isaac Newton, right? Where all of these amazing insights about how things work he had, but there is something beyond him that that is sort of changing things. And you and I have talked about it before, how we have, there's postulations that the universe is a hologram, right? So what happens to his philosophy if space and time isn't necessarily real, or having the experience of consciousness in order to integrate perception and experience to come to an a priori knowledge. I saw an article this week, and the headline of it was, is it time to give up the idea of consciousness as the ghost in the machine, right? So science and philosophy, like I said, we're not there yet, I don't think. But I think we're getting to that point. The light is starting to focus down where there's going to be something that sort of breaks our Newtonian mechanics and we enter into a relativistic, relativity or quantum realm.
Quantum philosophy. How about that?
Quantum philosophy. I like that.
I think that all the talk of the writing about the discussion of the idea that we're drawing closer to the singularity being the moment when artificial intelligence concatenates, wakes up, that all of the technology and science give birth to that which is other, even though these have been tools of us. And there's been endless science fiction to explore that. But that's what I would call quantum philosophy.
Yeah.
You are going to encounter, or quite probably will encounter, we will be encountering something that we have made that is totally not us and quite possibly much better than we are at some things. And what do we do with that? And how does that change our role and in it?
And even though that's, that's sort of the next level, that's what is beyond, Kantian philosophy still has a lot to say about that sort of thing, right? Because, talking again about the thing in itself and the a priori knowledge and filtering perception through experience in order to know things, all of those sort of concepts can be applied to an artificial intelligence. Or like we were talking about before the show, we were talking about my one cat. So if I'm on the other side of a screen door, the cat will hiss at me because he doesn't recognize me. If I'm inside, he loves me. Just all he wants to do is be petted. But if I'm on the other side of a screen, he suddenly doesn't know who I am and he wants to hiss at me. But if I show the cat his reflection in a mirror, I can hold him right up and he can touch his own reflection and things and he doesn't react at all. So what's going on inside the cat's head? We'll never know because
we are a human.
Right. He's the thing in itself and we are not. And I talked about it a few weeks ago, I think. I watched a special on eyeballs, right? And the expert there, they gave visualizations of what it looked like through the eyes of other animals. And of course, he prefaced it by saying repeatedly, he didn't just say it one time, it was repeatedly, this is, maybe what the physical perception of looking through the thing's eyes would be, but how that thing takes the light and integrates it in its brain and comes to use that information, we have no way of knowing.
There you are. And that's where, again, Kant is timely. He says we cannot step outside of our human perspective to see what lies beyond it or outside of it. Well, we talked about perspective once too, right? You can what you just described. We can imitate or extrapolate how the eye works, functions, and therefore what the animal would see. But perspective is how it sees it in the course of all the other experiences that it has had. And no, we can't know that.
Yeah.
We can imitate it. We can do VR. We can, which is amazing. And it's another. Kant actually used the word matrix, by the way, but but I think he would have enjoyed that film.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can fool ourselves, so to speak. And then we get into, as we've talked about once upon a time, about whether we're having a real experience. If I'm in VR and I'm picking up a lightsaber and defending myself, am I really picking up a lightsaber and defending myself? If I'm sitting outside and somebody else is watching me, I've got these goggles on and I've got my two controllers and I'm moving them around. I'm not really doing it. And yet in my head, I'm really doing it. And so, wow.
Yeah. And, that obviously plays into the whole hologram theory, right? If we can create such, a realistic experience with our limited capabilities, what's in the outside universe, that can create such things for us. They are the embodiment of our experience, right? And so that all that stuff is real interesting because it seems sort of ridiculous, right? Well, I have this rich inner life, so it's not fake. It's not an algorithm or and some other thing. Like this is real life. This is me. But when we talk about AI, right, the singularity and Kant's thing within itself and how perception integrates into perspective. Mm-hmm. If we are to create it, we are almost to the point where we could create an AI that has experiences. And again, the question is, well, if we can create that, who knows what
else might have been? Yeah,
we know that our science points to the fact that the universe is probably finite. There's probably something outside of it. There might be multiple universes. There might be all kinds of different things. So we don't know, right? Yeah. And now that's a huge metaphysical thing. So we might as well transition to what Kant thought about that, right? So some people like to kind of, I guess, disparage him as being a Christian philosopher, but he really wasn't. He was pretty agnostic, and basically what he was saying was, hey, we have all the experiences. There's absolutely no way of empirically proving that there's God, but if that's your first step with anything, you're trying to empirically prove something. Mm-hmm. If you can't do that, the next thing you try to do is empirically disprove it. If you can't do either one, then you can't fault somebody for believing in God because morality is filtered through the perspective of the person. So they're not wrong for believing, right?
Yeah. And that's what allowed him to consider the categorical imperative and put it to the test with people. Are you going to do a thou shalt not? All right. You want that to be universal? Yes. Thou shalt not kill. Make it universal. Can it be universal? Yeah, if nobody ever shoots anybody else again. In wartime, in peacetime, self-defense time, no, you shall not kill. That would be a universal principle.
Right.
But there are all sorts of mitigating circumstances.
Yeah,
right?
It creates, like we talked about, his reason, the reasoning behind these things. So, thou shalt not kill, right? That sounds like an excellent commandment. Yeah. We should never kill another person. And
it doesn't even say that another person. It just says thou shalt not kill.
Period. So if you didn't, life wouldn't exist because you have to kill plants even to live. You can't eat. Yeah, you can't eat if you don't kill.
And that's what the Jains, Jain, that religious group. Keep going.
Yeah, Jainism is a fascinating philosophy. Yeah. And I want listeners to know we're gonna explore some of this stuff in the future. I know we've looked at Hegel and now we've looked at Kant. Okay, European philosophers. We're familiar with them. A lot of our thought is based on them, but I definitely want to explore Eastern, African, and all kinds of different philosophies and philosophers in the future. And women philosophers, all this different kind of stuff. So we'll get there eventually. But man, where was I? Okay, thou shalt not kill, right? So even if we take it in the narrow sense of thou shalt not kill another person, you can start out with all the good, okay, so now there's no war. Oh, good, right? Right, great, okay. But then you do get into these other difficult scenarios. Well, what if somebody is suffering? What about abortion? What about
our pets? So no, that's not human, but...
Yeah, but
why do we apply one principle here and another principle there?
Yeah, and my friend was saying this the other day, right? My friend has a brother who's a huge hunter, right? Mm-hmm. Loves hunting things. When they were younger, during a raccoon hunt, they're hunting for raccoons, right? They found a raccoon that had been hit in the road and had 2 baby raccoons, and they raised the baby raccoons. Right?
Yep,
so,
yep.
I mean, in that case, you're applying these differential behaviors to the same species. And, that what I have looked at it as is that's evolution and work, right? Babies are meant to be cute so that they are taken care of, right?
Yeah, even animal babies. Right?
But rationally, you think about these are going to grow up to be something that you want to hunt. You know?
Yeah. What's going on there?
Yeah.
And do you need to hunt it?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you just do it because you wanna? And because Kant also, it wasn't simplistic. And so there's well, it's kind of the classic, the axe murderer thing. The axe murderer is coming after a person. The person runs into your house. In some versions of this thought experiment, the person's a friend, some not. Runs in, hides. He's after me. Don't tell him I'm here. Person comes to the door. Is this person here? Well, if your categorical imperative is you cannot lie, then you throw your friend under the bus, or worse. But Kant also made it very clear that when you are encountering a variety of problems at once, then you sift through what is the priority of your ethics. But at the same time, you have to accept that you're violating ethics, even by the decision that you're making. So yes, I will not put my friend under the bus, so I am in fact lying. That is something that has made me flawed and human and less than capable of achieving the goal. And that needs to be recognized. Why? To keep us humble. So we're not proud of the fact. Even and that's, I think, where people don't want to go.
Yeah.
They want to be really sure, and that was right, that's always right. They gotta be careful about that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's basically it, right? Is that people want to think of ethics and morality as black and white, and they are simply not. Every single decision, has some sort of ethical upside and downside. Mm-hmm. And, our example of thou shalt not kill is great, right? Because we're all going to kill. We're all going to kill on a regular basis. But within that, there's a range of ethical issues, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a vegetarian, and though, depending on what your views are, that's much more ethical than killing and eating a person, right? Mm-hmm. Or a different animal. There's a range, there's sort of this hierarchy, right?
Thank you, Clarice.
Yeah. So now in Kant's philosophy, where is the authority for that coming from? Is it from the person?
That's really interesting, because I think he would say it's from the person, but only the mature person. And by maturity, he meant the capacity to think for yourself. Do you think for yourself what's right at that moment in that situation, according to a structure of things that are right and not right? Because if you assert that there are moral laws beyond yourself, then you have to come to terms with them in your own behavior, unless you're being lazy. And that's what he would say is the immature person. I just do it because somebody else told me that. No, if you wrestle with it, and no matter how fast the wrestling might be, light speed thought, then you're actively mature and acting according to a natural moral law that is beyond us.
Yeah, and we've talked about this in the past, right? Thou shalt not kill. Do you think it's wrong to kill? Yes. Well, that's lazy, right? You have to think about what it means to kill. Yes. The last episode we did talking about belonging, right? I did that. My friend said, "Yeah, I think happiness is a feeling of belonging." I said, "No, it's not. You can be happy without belonging." But then, you start thinking about it rationally. You start going back. You start, well, yeah, I guess, if there was no belonging, mm-hmm. there is a direct effect if you follow it all the way through the reasoning to the beginning. Now, once you're at the end of it, and you're looking at it, once you have the preconditions met, there might be a case where you can be happy without belonging. But if you take it all the way back to the beginning, there had to be some sense of belonging in order for there to be happiness.
Well, Kant speaks to this, by the way. He doesn't call it belonging, but he calls it a social dissociability or asociability. He essentially asserts that most human beings just really want to spend more of their time by themselves. But they realize that they probably wouldn't survive without that. And so there have to be associations and dependencies and interactions. And so that's the structural sociability that is required to maintain the individual. But he acknowledged that it's not simple. So essentially, I think in some ways he didn't use the terms, of course, because they weren't They weren't there yet, but we're talking about introversion and extroversion. We're talking about the idea of the total individual versus the necessity of the social structure. And that, again, takes active thought to work out. Not just because some politicians say, this is what you should do. Believe in me because I am me, and therefore you do this because I would do this. Not lazy.
Yeah.
Nope, doesn't count. Nor does, well, I read it in a book and therefore it's so. All right, well, I'm one of those book-learned people. It's been my whole life. But do I just parrot things and say, well, that's it because X said that? No, it's interesting because X said that. What do I think about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Because a book can dictate something to you the same way that, anybody else can. So, yeah, there has to be other things met, right? There has to be reasoning used. Okay, who is the source of this knowledge? Where did they obtain it? What methods did they use to obtain it? How do I rectify that with other things that I can know through a priori or a posteriori methods? There has to be some work put in order for
Exactly.
So it's kind of an interesting thing to say, right? Because it sounds a bit relativistic to say, well, your morality or ethics really depends on how mature an individual is. Because, we tend to think of this concept of morality or ethics as being something greater than the individual, something that is out there that we're trying to discover rather than something we are creating.
Your unsocial sociability. So Kant is building on the idea of the social contract. What do I have to give up in order to be part of the social? And again, this is timely because if you have two groups that are adamant that they aren't going to give up anything, by gods. We're not going to compromise. We're not going to. Well, good. We're actually going to finish ourselves off then. Let's just you give things up. That's part of daily life, and most people would say that. But then they get to a place where they say, nope, not giving that, not giving this. Oh, really? Why? What is it that should or shouldn't be, and how come? And that's what that's what one tries to do, not to tell people, you must be philosophers. No, you already are, if you're thinking. And we've said this before. But does this not deserve some thought? Is really what we want to plant in people.
Yeah, exactly. Philosophy, it's not this thing that's disembodied from everyday life. It's not something that you and I are just sitting and doing here in this room for an hour on a Saturday, right? It's something that everybody does all the time as long as they're thinking about these bigger topics. Yeah. But Kant would say, you have to think about them. You can't just.
You are required to.
Right.
You can't just go along with the flow.
So, Kant believed morality and aesthetic judgment could kind of be achieved through reason. Do you agree with that? Do you think you can reason your way into having an understanding of morality or ethics or aesthetics?
I do. I probably not entirely. But when I think about what I enjoy in art, I take art lessons. I have what do I enjoy making? Why do I enjoy that? And there are many reasons. What do I find those little glints of beauty or the sublime, which aren't the same? We know that. And can I work out from my own art what I think is a sense of the aesthetic? Well, that's a start, but my own art isn't the be-all, end-all. And this is the other thing Kant said. You're not the only person in the universe, essentially.
Right.
Wake up, snap out of it, think about... So can we look at things that across time people have called beautiful in an aesthetic sense? Well, what was the aesthetic set of principles in the 1700s and the 1800s and the 1900s? Have some of those changed? Yes. Why might they have changed? Do they still adhere for oneself now? Do they seem to adhere for the social collective now? That's a lot of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a lot of engagement. Doesn't mean you're going to have the answers. It means well, why do I find that?
Yeah.
Art.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And I think that, in order to answer, you would have to divorce morality from aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that achieving a sense of morality, moral judgment through reasoning is different from establishing aesthetic judgment through reasoning. We've talked about morality a little bit.
No.
Aesthetics, man, it's hard because for me, what I'm thinking of is was a couple things, right? I did a painting this week.
I noticed your palette was washed up. I knew you must have done it.
What's funny is that, so okay, I have this picture and I want to paint it, and I paint it, and then I reach a point, right, where I think, okay, I can't contribute anything more to this because
when the painting's done.
Yeah, because I don't have the skills yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I reached that point, and then I said, you know what? Maybe I'm just not being confident enough. So I'm going to continue to try to add things. And then from that point, it was about 50-50. About half the stuff I added, I think, made the painting better. And about half of it, I think, made it worse, in my judgment. So that's interesting, right? Like the painting, I'm not completely satisfied with it because I want it to be better, but I don't have the skill. So somewhere, even though I do not possess the artistic ability to create it, somewhere in my brain, I do know I've reasoned out what I think looks good, right?
Yes.
So that's interesting. But then think about this, and this is where it gets a little weird, right? Okay.
I'm looking at your piece while you're talking about that.
Let's say you're somebody who appreciates photorealistic painting, right? So, wow, that's incredible technical skill. And then you're also somebody who appreciates abstract painting, which is the opposite. How do you reason? What is the reasoning behind the aesthetic appreciation for both? Do you think you can sort of reason yourself into a corner that way, or how?
Well, there's aesthetics is. I did an honors class in aesthetics with a particularly vibrant student. You would have liked him, who wanted to just study aesthetics. We were reading foundational pieces on aesthetics across a few centuries. Okay, and then we went into the college art gallery and we just talked about what we were looking at. And you reason toward a set of principles for a particular school of art. So the abstract may not appeal to everyone, but if you look at a number of abstract pieces, you will probably be able to discern things that work and things that don't. And if you do, you can say, okay, fine. Let's just say up front, it's not for me if you decide to take that position. Okay, so you're not going to necessarily be emotionally moved by it, but can you still discern what's better and what's not? And if you think that you can, there are some principles that you're determining that by. So you're not reasoning yourself into a corner so much at all. If you say for this category, this is why categorical, for Kant was so important. For this category of art, what do I assert? And then if you've done that for a bunch of categories, then you can start looking at the macro view and say, okay, what have I said about each of the? I said this here. I said this here. I see some universal principle emerging.
Yeah, and we talked about this a few months ago. It was a pretty fascinating conversation where I can't remember what the episode was, but we were trying to deduce what did make art. And it essentially was, is it just perspective? Is it just contrast? What is it? Because like you said, if you try to triangulate, regardless of cultural or human, humanity as a whole, what elements might be aesthetically pleasing. If you just look at your own personal tastes and try to triangulate what is good based off of images that you like, you realize it has to come down to something very basic. Don't you think?
I used to, but I don't. I think, it depends on what you mean by basic. Does it mean one principle? No. Does it come down to 15 or 20? If that's basic, then okay. Yeah.
Well, here,
composition, as an example. right?
Yeah.
Go. You were going to say
No,
something.
no. Go on. I'm going to look some up.
Well, all right. So I'm looking at. This is where this would be nice to be able to put it up on this on the screen, right? But I'm looking at your piece and I'm thinking what my art teacher says to me. First, she's not particularly interested in photographic realism, nor am I. So an impression of a human being can be quite accurate structurally from a perspective, but maybe I'm using values of purple and green in order to render a face because I find that emotionally true to that person. That's not photorealism. And yet I am not caricaturing the face if I'm doing a fairly realistic impression of the piece. She also, we've had this discussion many times, she and I, about when do you stop? When's the last stroke? When are you starting to overdo it? You get the sense of, I did this on a sketch last week. I'd broken through on a sketch that same week. I'd broken through with a pencil sketch, which I then used watercolor on. And then a separate pencil sketch in which I barely rendered hair, just enough to make you know that the hair was there. And didn't I, the very next phase, just HB pencils, 2B pencils, and it's so heavy, it was just, I did not want to look at it again. Mm-hmm. At the moment, I thought I was getting somewhere. I pulled back and said, hey, what have you done? And that was the instructive moment to say, okay, then don't do that again. So you, as the artist, will know when you've come to the place where it's either at the limit of your current skill or when, one more white streak on the top of the waves would just make it seem wrong. Mm-hmm. There is something echoing that wrong, but we don't necessarily know what that is.
Yeah, and that's where it gets real interesting to me, and where I see the merits of the reasoning and the morality question. Mm-hmm. And the aesthetics one, I have a little bit of a harder time seeing it because I feel like there's an emotional part of aesthetics that is divorced from reasoning. And the example I was gonna bring up is, like we were talking about triangulating things that we like, right? Yeah. Looking at different paintings. So there are some photorealistic paintings that I like and some that I don't like. Okay. That doesn't say anything about the skill of the artist, right? They're doing things that I could not dream of, but I just don't like the piece.
But it's their choices.
Right.
It's the artist's choices that somehow have led to that impression.
It's the same thing with abstract pieces, right? There's some that I look at and I like, and some that I look at and I don't like. Well, one of them that I really like is The Black Square by Kazimir Malevich. So that's about as basic as you get, right? So I think if you take that, right, and this is a famous painting, so
you can look it up.
A lot of people
could look it up.
A lot of people do like this painting.
Yeah.
So there is something about it that is aesthetic, but it's two-tone. There's just black and white.
Yep.
And there's just one shape, a square. Mm-hmm. So the number of elements that you could use to associate this painting with any other painting really is very limited. All right? Very limited. So from a reasoning aspect, could I say I like the contrast? Yes. Could I say I like the shape? Yes. But beyond that, there's not much. But there's an emotive element. If you just look at the painting, if you just glance at it, it's nothing special to me. To me personally, right? My opinion is not authoritative at all. And that's what I'm saying. But if I just stare at it for a long time, all of a sudden I start to have this emotional connection that informs my aesthetic opinion.
Yes, and Kant never said you're not going to be. If people have accused him of saying, "Oh, you just want us to be rational about our ethical decisions," but I'm going to link this directly to what you just said. He didn't say that there's no emotionality. He was saying that what's required is trying to figure out to what degree your emotions are affecting your reasoning, and are they overwhelming the reasoning? That's different than are they contributing toward the thought. So you see this piece, you look at it long enough, now it's triggered thinking. You're thinking about why I don't like this. Mm-hmm. And now, well, I guess I recognize that I don't like this. So I'm having this emotional response, but you've got the cognitive going on. He was saying that Kant's aesthetics, essentially, when he wrote about aesthetics, way simplifying, but it's just saying it's not all that different than moral judgment in the sense that you're looking for a universal principle. And if you can't find a universal principle, then what's getting in the way of that?
Yeah, and okay, and that's a keen insight because, I have thought about this. So there's the visual aspect of it, right? You could say, okay, I like the contrast and I like the shape, and that's about it because that's all there is to the painting, right? Right? But when I think about the emotional element, if I just say, well, I like it, then that's not good enough. That's not reasoning.
Right.
But I know why I like it. The reason that I like it is because the black and the white contrast reminds me of a black hole, like we were talking about before, and the event horizon. But the square shape of it is uniquely human, right? And so if you stare at it long enough, you feel like you're getting sucked into this thing, but it's not natural.
Yeah.
It's a man-made thing.
I'm looking at it right now.
It's almost just a visual metaphor for the singularity that we were talking about, right? You're getting sucked towards this thing, but it's not natural, and it's kind of pulling you in. And that's the kind of stuff that I love thinking about and philosophizing about normally. And this very simplistic painting represents that visually to me. That might not have been the artist's intent or whatever, but so there is a rationalization behind the emotive connection as well as the visual. So I guess that in that sort of way,
yeah, you've hit it. You're doing it.
So that informs my aesthetic reasoning for enjoying a piece of art.
And you said nothing about all the cracks inside of it.
Yeah.
You look really, I mean, if you bring, I brought it up again because I know she and I have talked about this before. If you bring up this piece, there is a universe of values of light in it that from which you can free associate shapes. I just looked and I saw Winnie the Pooh's heffalump. So now I'm seeing a gazelle. Now wait a minute. Where's the light coming from in order to make that? So some light is appearing somewhere within that black frame in order to make this.
Yeah, and it's reminiscent of fractal geometry, of the shape of the universe, of neurons in the human brain, all of these different things.
Yes.
Right? So this very, very simplistic piece of art triggers all of these connections to other things that you experience.
When you settle, when you consider it, when you don't just say, I hate it. Next.
Yeah.
Which is not the mature view. Okay, let's engage with this. And of course, people who say, I don't want to engage. All right. But if that's the standard response to most everything, then you are exactly what you're disengaged.
Yeah.
You're flying along at cruise control. So a side question, even though I'm free associating here, I would ask somebody I don't want to engage. I don't want to engage in anything. Good. Tell me what it's like to be in the car, which you must because of your consistency's sake. You'll buy a fully automated car. You'll sit and you'll just be disengaged and let the car do the work. I would never let a car do my work for me. Oh, well, why is that? I don't trust it. Oh, but you trust your mind to be disengaged?
Yeah. The
car is probably going to be a better driver than you in some ways. Okay, but you won't trust that. I don't want to go there either with a car. Full disclosure, but Kant says look for consistency. How dare you say it's just fine to be disengaged and be on cruise control, and then say, no, I don't want to be disengaged. You can't have it both ways all the time.
Right. Yeah. That was a really good. That was a good discussion. So. I guess the last part we'll tie it up with is Kant thought that world peace could be achieved through democratic globalism, kind of, right? Do you think that's a reasonable thing to think, especially given today's context?
Among many things that he was talking about, he suggested that he was one of the first people who suggested, without saying it as directly, people think it's a 20th century thing, but it's not that to observe that democracies, he was just at the beginning of this idea, right? But essentially democracies don't fight with each other to the death. Why is that? Well, back to this unsocial sociability. There are things that we think that we want or that we need. If the culture is fixated on providing you things that you want and need and letting you make choices, and choice being the most important thing of all, then it's likely that you're going to have a growth of those kind of systems that would then settle the planet down. But it requires a maturity that would not let you be asleep at the wheel when you're doing this.
Yeah, and there's a lot of human complexity in this issue as well, right?
Oh, yeah,
because that's a big statement, right? World peace can, and I think that in some ways it does ignore cultural factors, right? And how some societies operate. But I also think that, we've talked about this in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Is pure democracy the perfect form of government? Probably not, right? Because democracy hands decision-making into the hands of the majority. Well, let's say the hands of the majority are not mature individuals, right? People who haven't reflected and thought about things. All of a sudden, your society is being guided in not the most efficacious or beneficial manner.
True, but I'd rather have that than what... We're at so many tipping points. I'd rather have that than theocracy. Because theocracies are what have led to a lot of major conflicts that we have experienced, but that have been experienced, and that are being experienced now. And that the founders, flawed as they were, of varying degrees of race, systemic race intent, still had the idea, and this is what Kant would applaud, still had the idea that everyone could be equal. But that would require using the word everyone and sticking with it, which is our challenge now. But they also had the sense to say, no, religion shouldn't be ruling government. And we see that being thrown away this week. We see that being thrown away in so many ways. So if you have a group of people who say, well, my religion is going to dominate the values of this entire culture, then you've said, okay, I'm not interested in democracy anymore. I want a theocracy. And then someone might, how dare you say that? That's not what I'm saying. Well, tell me what a theocracy is. What is it that you're trying to do? Are you trying to assert that your principles should govern everybody? To the removal of choice about many things for them.
So let's think about this then. If you have a pure democracy, but the majority of your country is made up of a certain religious group and they vote for these principles, then you end up in this, you have the same ends with different means, correct?
You could, unless you have checks and balances. Unless you have a judiciary that will not make decisions based on theocratic notions. We used to have that. It's going away. And so if a judiciary will assert the values of one group, then you've lost perspective, then you've lost balance, and then things spiral.
We're getting into like a super fascinating discussion about politics and government, and it should be its own show. So we're
backing up.
Yeah, we should definitely do that at some point. But I know that we're just not going to have the time to get into it. No. But I mean, it's something that I've thrown out in the past episodes talking about perfect forms of government and things. And This is a question that's been thought about by philosophers for a long time, right? Is a meritocracy, right? If you have a government that is, you have a representative element, but you also have people who are put into positions of policymaking who are the most qualified to fulfill those positions. Because I tell you what I'm thinking of long term, and looking at the big picture, you see our global warming and our population issues and things, right? The problem with democracy, which we don't have, we have a representative republic, but even if we had a democracy, the issue would be the same, right? Is our democracy is so married to unbridled capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if you let people make decisions about their needs and wants, right? Those two terms.
The short term. Yeah.
Right. Then you can just deplete resources at whatever rate is possible, because your system is married to the idea of continual growth. At some point, I think that there has to be a reasonable voice saying, okay, the job of the government is to provide for your needs, and you're going to need to find ways to fulfill your wants outside of material material possessions, right?
Believe what you will believe.
Guess what? You can feel fulfilled and supply your wants without going out and buying stuff. And if you had people in policy making positions in government who were in the best position to determine what the resources are that are available, what the policy directives could be, and then you had a representative element that could provide the voice of the people, the majority of people as well. In my very I haven't thought about this deeply, right? But I've thought about it.
You're in the process of.
I'm in the process of it right now, so I'm sure that there's flaws. There's things that are going to be wrong about it, but whenever we talk about democracy and espouse the values of democracy, like Kant kind of was, right? This democratic globalism. There's always something in there that, to me, that says, I don't know. And I know that's a dangerous thing to say. I'm not espousing communism or, any of these other things.
It's not dangerous. No, it is not dangerous to say. That's where I will counter you as friend to friend and as talker to talker. When we say something is dangerous to say, we've already removed the choice to talk about it. It is not dangerous to talk about it. You're saying, I'm not going to assert that communism is better, but it's not a dangerous thing to think about, to understand what it means. And people way too often think they know what it means. They have not a clue.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, if you reflect on it and you look at the ideals of it, it's not a bad idea in theory, right? Hey, let's treat everybody equally and, and you've seen the numbers. Well, maybe you haven't. I've seen the numbers where if let's say the United States was to distribute all of its wealth equally, essentially every person in the U.S. would be entitled to around $200,000 a year, right? So imagine that world, right? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? There's a lot that needs to be thought out about that. And communism really has not been executed in reality at all.
No.
That primarily comes down to having a dictatorial figure that's enforcing rules. And it's hard to do it otherwise because humans have that drive to set themselves apart and to be better. It's that's part of biology.
But capitalism hasn't either.
Right, exactly.
We don't want the landfills near us, but we want to get rid of our garbage every week. But we don't want to take other people's garbage because that's theirs after all. They got to find some place to put it. Sooner or later, you fill the ocean. So it's just that Kant would say consistency. Would you take a person in your family, let's say, and put him in a building, let's say a warehouse, and lock the door? And start a car running and make them stay in there and just breathe the car running. One car. Now, for a while, you're not going to notice, but after a while, you're going to have what are you doing? That's not safe. That's not right. But we can do it to the planet. There's not a consistency there.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, man, that's super interesting. When we're going to definitely do a show on politics and government at some point, which will just make everybody angry. But it'll be great.
We'll have fun.
This has been great, and we haven't even scratched the surface of Kant, which is the crazy part. But I think we did a good job sort of sampling different ideas from his philosophy. So until next time, keep pondering.